The history of Ukrainian literature reflects the country's tragic conflicts, its diverse population, and the people's distinctive humor, writes John Self. In 2014, when Russia annexed the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, the Russian satirist Vladimir Sorokin wrote about the reaction of his friends to the fighting that followed. "I can't believe that Russia and Ukraine are fighting. It's like a nightmare," said one. Another added, "All of us Russians are sitting in a huge theater, watching a play called Ukraine. And you can't leave the theater. Now we are all watching, as transfixed and horrified as Sorokin and his friends. But what we are seeing, behind the news, is something more enduring, a representation of the character and qualities of Ukraine and its people. It is a place that, because of its unique geopolitical location and turbulent history, has been richly recorded in books and stories for many years, and continues to inspire writers today." BBC Culture set out to explore Ukraine's literary history, and speak to writers who know it best. Boris Drayliuk is a Ukraine-born writer and translator, now living in the US. When asked about how Ukraine is represented in writing, he identifies one of the fathers of its literature as Taras Shevchenko, 1814–1861, the national poet of Ukraine, a sort of Pushkin-like figure who was born into serfdom, whose talent bought him his freedom. One of Shevchenko's poems is A Cherry Orchard by the House, 1847, a tiny little lyric, says Drayliuk. It won't strike you as brilliant poetry, but for Ukrainians, it's the very image of home. It just lodges in your heart and you can't shake it. He also names the poet Lyzhaya Ukrainka, 1871–1913, who was influenced by Shevchenko and was, says Drayliuk, a kind of proto-feminist figure, and you can tell by her choice of pseudonym that she was very much, if not a nationalist then a patriot. Her image has been on Twitter frequently, because Ukrainian women have shown so much courage recently, so she's become a symbol of that kind of resistance. Neither Shevchenko nor Ukrainka, however, is well known outside Ukraine. It's disappointing, if apt, that some of the best-known early portrayals of Ukraine in literature are by outsiders, particularly those depicting the Crimean War of the 1850s. This conflict between Russia and an alliance including Britain and France was described by commentators as a boozy fiasco characterized by notoriously incompetent international butchery. In England, the poet laureate Alfred, Lord Tennyson depicted a suicidal British mission during the war in his most famous poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1854, which portrayed with bitter irony the stupidity of the army leadership, someone had blundered, and admiration for the soldiers following their orders, stormed at with shot and shell / into the mouth of hell / rode the 600. From the Russian side, the Crimean War produced probably the world's first war correspondent, when a young officer in the Russian army with an interest in literature filed reports on the siege of the port of Sevastopol in 1854–55, and for the first time signed his full name to his writing, Leo Nikolaevich Tolstoy. His 3 Sevastopol sketches show Tolstoy's qualities in an early form, a blend of politics and personalities, rigorous historical reconstruction, and an acute eye for larger-than-life characterization. Ukraine is a country with an innate sense of humility, a great sense of humor, and a very healthy self-regard, Boris Drayliuk. The sketches read like fiction, full of life and death, but for Tolstoy, the hero of my story, whom I love with all my heart and soul, was the truth. He didn't care whether his sketches offended anyone, all the characters are equally blameless and equally wicked, and they made him into a literary celebrity. I failed to become a general in the army, he wrote, but I became one in literature. The examples of Tolstoy and Tennyson illustrate the enduring image of Ukraine as a place not just divided but torn by conflict. What we now call Ukraine, it has been an independent nation for only 3 decades, was historically a crossing point from west to east. In the 19th century, western Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the east was ruled by Russia. In the early 20th century, it was briefly united as the Ukrainian People's Republic, before once more being split between Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, and then becoming part of the Soviet Union. One way of looking at its tempestuous history is that western Ukrainian city now known as Lviv was known variously as Lvov, Lwów, or Lemberg, depending on who was in charge at the time. Another way is to listen to Ukraine-born writer and humorist Mikhail Bulgakov, who once reflected wryly that in the years after 1918, in his home city of Kiev there were 14 changes of power, 10 of which I experienced personally. Bulgakov's own contribution to the literature of Ukrainian conflict is his first major work, The White Guard, 1925, which takes place during one of those battles for control of Kiev, and follows the misfortunes of the once wealthy Turban family. The book fell foul of Soviet censors for its failure to include a communist hero. Even today, Ukraine produces writing that reflects ongoing wars. Delgadoedu names one of the country's most important contemporary poets as Lyuba Yakynhuk, who, he says, was a refugee from Donbas, from the war zone, and she has written very movingly about that experience. Her 2016 poem Crow Wheels highlights the apparent never-ending escalation of conflict. When the city was destroyed, they started fighting over the cemetery. A melting pot of cultures. But we do Ukraine an injustice if we focus on its literature of conflict and ignore its other qualities. One of its most distinctive traits is that, because of the country's status as an east-west meeting point, it is a melting pot of cultures, particularly in the western cities like Lviv and Odessa. Ukraine-born Jewish writer Isaac Babel, born 1894, made his name as one of the key figures in 20th century literature through a relatively sparse output before he was killed as part of Stalin's terror campaign in 1940. Babel wrote that no iron can pierce the heart with the force of a full stop / period put in just the right place, and although he too wrote about war, in his Red Cavalry sequence, it's his Odessa stories that conjure most beautifully the character of melting pot Ukraine. Delgadoedu, who was born in Odessa, has translated Babel's stories into English. The Odessa stories are mostly about the Jewish gangster community and capture its energy and unpredictability in a way that make them read like a European Damon Runyon. One passage, where the narrator falls foul of gang kingpin Benya Krik, who got his way because he had passion, and passion rules the world, could be straight out of Runyon's Broadway stories. He kept on crying and stomping on me. My wife saw how much this upset me and commenced screaming. She started at 4:30 and didn't finish till 8. And how she gave it to him, oi, how she gave it to him. You should have seen it. Yes, that's what I was emulating for sure, says Delgadoedu. Damon Runyon, Ring Lardner, and Jewish-American authors like Bernard Malamud. One of the secondary losses arising from the Russian invasion, fears Delgadoedu, is that the Russian language you see in Babel's stories, which is part of Ukrainian culture, will shrink inevitably, because those who speak both languages will probably make an effort to speak Ukrainian rather than Russian. And that forecloses a whole rich tradition that could have remained open. I would much rather Ukraine be allowed to develop as a multilingual, multicultural place, which is what it was for the last 30 years. In Babel's stories, Odessa is presented with both affection and humor. It is, he wrote in 1916, the most charming of cities in the Russian Empire, where the living is light and easy. Its diversity is shown in steamers from Newcastle, Cardiff, Marseille, and Port Said. There are Negroes, Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Americans. But on the other side of society, the powdered wives of the city's plump and ridiculous bourgeoisie, succumb to the passionate caresses of temperamental students of medicine and law. Overall, Babel adds playfully, the reader will say, it sounds like Odessa is a city like any other, and you, sir, are simply biased in the extreme. In fact, this cynicism and self-mockery is perfectly in keeping with what the Ukraine-born novelist Yosef Witlin in 1946 called the abhorrence of solemnity and dislike of all manner of pomp in his beloved city of Lviv. Like Babel, he adored his city's diverse, colorful population, an extraordinary mixture of nobility and roguery, wisdom and imbecility, poetry and vulgarity. The Czech-French novelist Milan Kundera identified this as a quality more widely in Central Europe. Its people, he said, represent the wrong side of history. They are its victims and outsiders. It is this disabused view of history that is the source of their culture, of their wisdom, of the non-serious spirit that mocks grandeur and glory. Does this non-serious spirit apply to Ukraine too? I think so, says Delgadoedu. It's a country with an innate sense of humility, a great sense of humor, and a very healthy self-regard. The valorizing of the marginal, the wily, the trickster figure, the person who makes it by hook or by crook, the sort we see in Babel's stories, is ingrained in the culture. And what makes Ukrainian literature special is that it treats those figures with a great deal of nuance. I think it's part and parcel of the Ukrainian mentality. There's a wryness to the Ukrainian frame of mind. A turbulent century. Making a similar point is Ukraine-born poet and translator Nina Murray, whom BBC Culture also spoke to about the country's literature. There's a long-standing humorous tradition in Lviv, because it's always been a mixed city where different classes of people made fun of each other. But also the Jewish writer Sholem Aleichem is from Lviv and he was a great humorist. I'm biased because I'm from there too. Contemporary Ukrainian writers too share the non-serious spirit. Delgadoedu identifies the writer Andrei Lyubka's 2015 novel Carbide as a timely example. It's just wonderful. It's one of these bandit stories, where a history teacher decides to dig a tunnel under the Ukrainian border and sneak all 40 million Ukrainians into the EU. The books share a theme of irrecoverable loss, like missing parts of our own past that we cannot know anymore because the living memory is gone. Nina Murray. What other qualities does contemporary Ukrainian writing exhibit, and what can it tell us about the country? For Murray, some of the books she has translated share a theme of irrecoverable loss, like missing parts of our own past that we cannot know anymore because the living memory is gone. This may not be surprising given the losses Ukraine has suffered in its turbulent century. Ukrainian literature, she says, can explore what it feels like to have that hole behind you, and creative attempts to fill it. Murray notes that since 2014, the Ukrainian government put more resources into translating modern Ukrainian literature overseas, which is why we're now seeing that investment paying off. For her, one of the key voices is Oksana Zabuzko, who became very famous in Ukraine back in the 90s. She published this short novel called Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, 1996. And it was the first novel that was by a woman, about a woman navigating the post-colonial psyche, including in her relationships to Ukrainian men and other men. So she wrote about things that had never been written about before. Perhaps the best known internationally of contemporary Ukrainian writers is Andrei Kurkov, whose most recent novel Grey Bees, 2018, is set in the gray zone that arose between Russian separatists and Ukrainian troops in the southeast of the country following the 2014 annexation of Crimea. Kurkov's approach to the conflict is indirect. His hero, the beekeeper Sergei, has one of his hives impounded by Russian authorities, and when it's returned to him, it no longer works as a home for its bees. As gentle, naive Sergei travels from Donbas to Crimea, he encounters people representing modern Ukraine. They are generous, kind, resilient, all qualities we have seen in abundance under the present crisis. BBC Culture asked Murray and Delgadoedu to recommend other modern Ukrainian writers who are published in English but less well known than Kurkov. There's a great book by a poet called Irina Shavalova, says Murray. It's called Pray to the Empty Wells, and some of the poems reflect the process of comprehending the 2014 invasion and war. Delgadoedu suggests Yuri Andrukhovich, a more established writer whose works include The Moscoviot and 12 Circles, and who writes in a kind of surrealist vein, very jocular, very satirical, that can explain the nature of the Ukrainian mentality and its history. The Polish writer Ryszard Kapuscinski was present at the independence of Ukraine in 1991. In his book Imperium, he wrote that the future of Ukraine will develop in two directions, in terms of its relations with Russia, and in terms of its relations with Europe and the rest of the world. Writing from and about Ukraine cannot unify those two directions, but it can help us understand them. Delgadoedu and Murray are passionate about helping non-Ukrainians to use its literature to understand this country, which has too often been in the news for the wrong reasons. One work, only recently translated into English, which Delgadoedu enthuses about is Kiev-born Lev Ozarov's Portraits Without Frames, 1999, which provides short vivid portraits in verse of 50 key Ukrainian and Russian figures, including Isaac Babel, Boris Pasternak, and Anna Akhmatova. It's a very important book that hasn't received much attention, says Delgadoedu. But it's the work of a man whose identity is front and center now on our screens. Like Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, Ozarov was a Soviet-born Jewish person in the territory of Ukraine, who was as loyal to his Ukrainian identity as he was to his identity as a Russian writer. If only we had time to read it, we have a lot of other things to do. I think the book would give us a very valuable perspective on what it means to be Ukrainian. It's not just being some hardcore nationalist who drapes himself in the flag, he adds. It's having respect for the extremely diverse multilingual culture of the second largest country in Europe. 40 years since the death of the sci-fi author, whose stories have inspired films like Blade Runner and Minority Report, Adam Scoville explores how prophetic his work has been. I am in passport control. I can see my face on a screen. The technology recognizes me and lets me through. I scan codes showing my vaccination status and recent COVID test results. The machines assess the data regarding my health and microbiology. Through into the waiting room, people are staring into little screens. A strangely large number have the camera flipped, and are capturing their faces at different angles, as if they've forgotten what they look like. I open my laptop and join in. I give my details to a company to enter the digital realm. Adverts tailored to my personality pop up. They know me better than I know myself. Writers of science fiction often feel more prescient than others. Whether it's the threat to women's rights in the work of Margaret Atwood, the architectural and social dystopias of J.G. Ballard's novels, or the internet predicting world of E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops, 1909, the genre is replete with prophetic writers dealing with ever more familiar issues. Out of all such writers, few seem a more unlikely seer of our times than the U.S. author Philip K. Dick, who died 40 years ago today at the age of 53. In a remarkably prolific 30-year period of work, Dick authored 44 novels and countless short stories, adaptations of which went on to redefine science fiction on screen, in particular Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, 1982, which was based on Dick's story Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And Paul Verhoeven's Total Recall, 1990, which took his 1966 short story We Can Remember It For You wholesale as its source material. More recently, Dick's novel The Man in the High Castle, 1962, has been turned into a hit Amazon series. The man behind the visionary worlds. Dick was not simply an effective writer of strange fictions, but an unusual person in his own right. Burdened by deteriorating mental health, visions, and what he alleged were all manner of paranormal experiences, many of which were woven into his expansive oeuvre, Dick had a troubled and fragmented relationship with reality. In the 1970s, the author began to experience two parallel timelines of his own life, his thoughts invaded in 1974 by what he told interviewer Charles Platt was a transcendentally rational mind, something he had many names for, but chiefly VALIS, an acronym for Vast Active Living Intelligence System. It became the subject of one of his late semi-autobiographical works, the 1981 novel VALIS, published not long before his death. Dick's stories posited the ubiquitousness of the Internet, virtual reality, facial recognition software, driverless cars, and 3D printing. Stan Nichols. Whether his visions were medical or supernatural, one thing is clear, Dick had a startling ability to foreshadow the modern world. Celebrated science fiction and fantasy author Stan Nichols suggests Dick's work is prescient because it explored the future through the then present. His stories posited the ubiquitousness of the internet, virtual reality, facial recognition software, driverless cars, and 3D printing. Nichols tells BBC Culture, while also pointing out that it's a misconception that prediction is the primary purpose of science fiction, the genre's hit rate is actually not very good in that respect. Like all the best science fiction, his stories weren't really about the future, they were about the here and now. Indeed, Dick's incorporation of everyday aspects of post-war America into his futures has meant that his worlds possessed a surreal familiarity. Nevertheless, the way he also anticipated particular technological and societal developments remains striking. He had a lot of scientific images of the way the future would work, says Anthony Peake, author of the biography A Life of Philip K. Dick, The Man Who Remembered the Future, 2013. For instance, he had a concept that you would be able to communicate advertising to people directly, that you'd be able to know them so well that you could target the marketing precisely to their anticipations. And this is exactly what is happening online. Peake could be referring to any number of Dick's stories, the most famous in this regard being the 1956 story The Minority Report, adapted for the cinema in 2002 by Steven Spielberg. Screen adaptations have often latched onto the invasive nature of advertising in his work, yet the writer explored the theme in far more detail than as merely a background aesthetic, which is how it manifests on screen. In the 1954 short story Sales Pitch, for example, the idea of aggressive yet unnervingly personalized advertising finds fruition in a demented machine that constantly markets itself at the story's protagonist. In the 1964 novel The Simulacra, on the other hand, advertising is embodied by a mechanical fly-like creature. As he writes in the novel, the commercial, fly-sized, began to buzz out its message as soon as it managed to force entry. Say, haven't you sometimes said to yourself, I'll bet other people in restaurants can see me? It's a physical equivalent of spam or tailored adverts popping up on social media. Dick's political ideas. Dick's work often had a political dimension, too. The Man in the High Castle, for example, imagines an alternative history in which the Nazis won World War II. In lesser-known works such as Eye in the Sky, 1957, this politics is more of its period. In the novel, a group of people become stuck in various different worlds conjured by each individual, thanks to a malfunctioning particle accelerator. The narrative focuses especially on a world dreamed up by a communist member of the group who has been dismissed from the laboratory for holding such beliefs. The twist is that the world conjured with obvious over-the-top Marxist leanings is, in fact, the product of the lab security chief who is also a communist but in secret. The book showed that Dick's politics could not be simplified into a straightforward description of left or right, as he was biting in his attacks on both the McCarthyesque witch hunts of the period as well as the more evangelical leanings of communism. Dick argued we were existing in a simulation. Elon Musk caused controversy quite recently by effectively venturing the same idea, Anthony Peake. Dick was altogether anti-establishment. His stories feature authorities and companies consistently abusing their power, especially when it comes to surveillance. His worlds are ultra-commodified and their citizens addicted to materialism, while celebrity, media, and politics meld to create nightmarish, authoritarian scenarios, usually topped off with a heavy dose of technocracy and bureaucracy. This bureaucracy manifested itself in various forms throughout his work. In his 1974 novel Flow My Tears, the policeman said, set in a dystopian 1988 where the US is again ruled by a dictatorship, a singer and TV host called Jason Taverner wakes up to find himself in a world in which he is suddenly no longer famous and lacks the many documents now required to avoid being arrested and sent to a labor camp. Taverner may struggle to get beyond the basic spot checks and cordons in Flow My Tears, but other Dick characters struggle to do the most basic things, even in their own homes. In the 1969 novel Ubik, a character ends up arguing with the door to his apartment, as he doesn't have the change to get in via its coin-operated mechanism. The door even threatens to sue him when he tries to break it down. Every aspect of the lived experience becomes commodified in Dick's work, an aspect that feels deeply poignant. Dick sees a paywall future, where the amenities of our own homes all require a token offering, even if today that offering is personal information rather than loose change. Putting aside Dick's ability to foreshadow the future we now take for granted, his most unnerving vision was of the world itself ultimately being a simulation. Dick's reality was already a fragile and complex one. In many of his later books, the idea of reality being a facade grew as a dominant theme. Dick argued we were existing in a simulation, Peake suggests. Elon Musk caused controversy quite recently by effectively venturing the same idea. Whether his visions were, as he believed, a product of glitches in the simulation or his fading mental health, one thing is for certain: the world in which the work of Philip K. Dick is celebrated today feels ever closer to the ones imagined by this most unique and exceptional of writers. Michael Caine's role in the film version of Len Deighton's 1960s spy novel made him an icon. As a TV remake premieres, Neil Armstrong looks at the creation of a unique secret agent. In 2006, an ordinary-looking pair of spectacles went on sale at Christie's, the London auction house. They were expected to fetch up to £3,000, $4,088. In fact, they sold for £6,600, $8,994, and the buyer had bought a little piece of movie history. The spectacles were worn by Michael Caine when he played Harry Palmer in the 1965 espionage thriller The Ipcress File. Palmer, a former soldier, is introduced in a scene in which he is woken by his alarm clock, and reaches for his glasses before he gets out of bed. He's as blind as a bat without them, just one way in which he was not your typical action hero, certainly not back in the 60s. In a nod to the movie, the very first shot of the new television adaptation of The Ipcress File shows Palmer's thick-rimmed spectacles. This time, Joe Cole, perhaps best known for his role in Peaky Blinders, plays the chippy working-class spy who loves culture, cooking, and women but who doesn't have a lot of time for the posh public school boys who run British intelligence. Like the film before it, the ITV series is based on the 1962 bestseller by the great spy novelist Len Deighton, which was published shortly after the cinema release of Dr. No, the first installment in the James Bond film franchise. Deighton's hero, unnamed in the novel but christened Harry Palmer for the screen, was quickly identified by critics and fans as being the anti-Bond. James Watkins, director of the six-part adaptation, explains the differences between Ian Fleming's creation and Deighton's agent. Bond is a superhero, he tells BBC Culture. He kills without thinking or caring. He is establishment. He went to Eton. He uses his fists and his weapons more than his brain, gadgets, rather than real life. Harry is short-sighted. Working class. Haunted by killing in Korea. A reluctant spy. Blackmailed into working for the establishment, insolent Harry is a constant thorn in their side. Trying to make his way in a world that is stacked against him. Always facing a class barrier. He's so much more relatable than the dinosaur Bond. The makings of a genius thriller writer. Deighton, the London-born son of a chauffeur and a cook, wrote The Ipcress File, his first novel, on vacation in the Dordogne, France. It was, he writes in an afterword in the Penguin Modern Classics edition, a holiday diversion. He was a commercial artist, trained at St. Martin's School of Art and the Royal College of Art. He had worked for ad agencies and publishers, and knew Soho like the back of his hand. He had also seen a fair bit of the world, having completed 2.5 years of national service with the RAF, and worked as a flight attendant with British Overseas Airways. For The Ipcress File, he also reveals in the afterword, Deighton drew on his experiences at a smart ad agency where he had mixed with highly educated, witty young men who had been at Eton together. He had actually enjoyed it, especially the barbed banter, and it informed his depiction of the intelligence service offices. The Ipcress File suddenly made the spy story new, hip, disheveled, patched together. It is as essential to the early 60s as Mary Quant or A Hard Day's Night, Simon Winder. Nevertheless, Dayton, who is now 93 years old and retired from writing, has strong views on class and education. "I would do everything I can to prevent my children being educated in England," he told an interviewer on Thames TV's Afternoon Plus in 1983. His children were at a small village school in France, because the moment you step across the threshold of any school in England, you put on a uniform for the class war. "Everyone educated in England has been assigned rank badges for the class war." He would later acknowledge another key influence on his work. His mother sometimes cooked for Anna Wokoff, a white Russian émigré and Nazi sympathizer who lived near to the Dayton family. In 1940, the 11-year-old Len witnessed her arrest by a group of nondescript special branch officers who arrived in unmarked cars. Wokoff was subsequently imprisoned for spying activities. The incident stayed with Dayton, and made him aware that there was a secret world of espionage in which people might not be what they seemed. The complicated plot of Ipcress involves the brainwashing of British scientists by foreign powers, but it was the tone, characterization and sardonic style that impressed readers. Spy novelist Jeremy Duns, a fan of both Bond and Palmer, says Dayton's espionage novels are some of the greatest spy literature ever penned. There are at least 4 novels featuring the unnamed Harry Palmer, maybe more. The character's anonymity muddies the waters, and 9 about the middle-aged Secret Intelligence Service officer Bernard Sampson, as well as several stand-alone novels. I think the appeal of the Harry Palmer books and the films in the 60s was partly that the character was downbeat and relatively unglamorous, and made a contrast with the high fantasy of the Bond films, Duns tells BBC Culture. "I think Dayton was following in the footsteps of the angry young men writers of the 1950s, and you can see a lot of the same preoccupations, rebellion against authority being the most notable, but also these were kitchen sink spy stories. You literally saw Michael Caine in the kitchen making an omelette, though his hands were, famously, Len Dayton's in that scene." From book to iconic film. In fact, though, several key members of the production team responsible for the Bond films also worked on Ipcress. Dr. No's co-producer Harry Saltzman had approached Dayton to write the follow-up film, From Russia with Love. Dayton didn't work out as the 007 screenwriter, but Saltzman decided to make the Ipcress file, with the express intention of providing an alternative view of espionage to that provided by Bond. John Barry, who scored many of the Bond films, composed the evocative Harry Palmer theme. Production designer Ken Adam, who won a BAFTA for Ipcress, had a long association with the Bond franchise, making sets for 7 films, from Dr. No to Moonraker. Richard Harris and Christopher Plummer reportedly passed on playing Palmer, and the part went to Michael Caine, who had been a posh officer in his previous film, Zulu, and who had never before been the lead. He relished playing a role that was more like the real me, and it made him a star. The film really hammered home the contrast with Bond that was already evident in the novel. Where 007 was all about globe-trotting glitz, Palmer operates in a drab and dreary post-war world, a world in which tint champignons, he has a favorite brand, are about as glamorous as it gets. He regards the people he works for, who are also, supposedly, his social superiors, with derision. When one boss tells him he's being transferred, he wants to know if it will mean any more money. It's difficult to imagine Bond haggling with M over pay. In our modern world, where the social mobility promised in the 60s seems to have vanished, Harry is perhaps more relevant than ever, a true working-class hero. James Watkins. Film critics were surprised by Palmer's spectacles. Wendy Michener in Maclean's magazine noted that he was the only action-type hero I can think of who wears them. I can't remember another movie where the gal takes off the guy's glasses before seducing him, the Village Voice's reviewer, Andrew Saris, wrote. The fact that we see Palmer cooking was also considered radical. Food fetishism, one critic called it. In a scene in which Palmer is preparing dinner for a beautiful colleague, pinned to the kitchen wall is one of the cook strips of illustrated recipes that Dayton produced for the Observer newspaper. When it came to his attitudes to women, Meanwhile, Palmer was seen as a more progressive man than Bond. Michener approvingly observed that Palmer likes girls, but he also likes to find out if they're willing, instead of assuming as Bond does that any normal girl should be so lucky. And Variety noted the contrast with what it called the Bond razzmatazz and said that Kane's consistent underplaying adds considerably to the pull of the picture. The same review dubbed Palmer the anti-Bond. It was a success and was subsequently included on a British Film Institute list of the best 100 British films of the 20th century, although its two hastily produced sequels, 1960's IX's Funeral in Berlin and 1967's $1 Billion Brain, didn't make the grade. And all of Dayton's novels were reissued as Penguin Modern Classics last year, with his espionage fiction now acknowledged as representing a high point of the genre. Simon Winder, publishing director at Penguin Press, says, "The Ipcress file suddenly made the spy story new, hip, disheveled, patched together. It is as essential to the early 60s as Mary Quant or A Hard Day's Night." Until Harry Palmer wandered onto the scene, the traditions of the English spy novel were essentially upper-class ones, with John Buchan, Ian Fleming, and John Le Carre the masters of the genre. Dayton transformed this assumption. His work has a wide appeal. Fans have included Lemmy, the hell-raising frontman of rock band Motorhead, who said he never traveled without a Len Dayton novel, and the military historian Max Hastings, who calls Dayton's World War II novel Bomber probably the best thing ever written about the wartime air campaign against Germany. And now the television series, which also stars Lucy Boynton and Tom Hollander, is set to bring Palmer and Dayton to a whole new audience. With 6 episodes, there is more space than there was in the film to develop characters and fill out background. Fellow agent Jean Courtney, Boynton, for example, is now much more fully rounded and is at least the professional equal of Palmer. Neither series nor movie slavishly adheres to the novel, but both are faithful to its spirit. Fans will be pleased to see that TV Harry is still a good cook and a connoisseur of a proper cup of coffee. Director James Watkins says, "In our modern world where the social mobility promised in the 60s seems to have vanished, Harry is perhaps more relevant than ever, a true working-class hero." The Ipcress file begins on ITV in the UK in March, and will premiere on AMC Plus in the US soon.